Welcome to Tiffy Talk. And I will be talking to Ronald Bavero, who is an author of a book called Elephants Don't Marry Giraffes.
An elephant doesn't marry a giraffe is a very, very common expression used within the divorce industry by attorneys. Every industry has its little taglines, and that happens to be one that's particularly relevant to divorce cases. And it comes out of the notion that while we like to think that opposites attract, what I found in my profession is that it is more likely that people will end up marrying people who are extremely similar to them in temperament, in the way they look at life, all of those kinds of things. And so very often when I was the subject of a particular tirade by another attorney was telling me about all of the terrible things that my client did and said, the response is, yes, but you know what? An elephant doesn't marry a giraffe. Your client is no trip through the woods either.
That is not only interesting and entertaining, but you really learn a lot about the legal system. You learn a little bit about human nature. You learn a little bit about how crazy, insane people can go. But I think the most important thing is learning about what it's like to get a divorce before you actually embark in the journey. And one of the things that people don't do is they don't have a clue what they're getting into before they get a divorce. So I think it's a book that's almost should be mandatory for anyone to read before they start the divorce process. So thank you, Ronald, for joining us today. I'm really, really happy to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm very passionate about divorce. And one of my advocating that I do is I really try hard to keep people out of the courts, which, I don't have to tell you how difficult that in itself is, because when people are going through a divorce, they mostly want to eat each other alive. So I love that you have that, because I figure if I can't keep people out of court, which mostly I wouldn't, at least I can give them your book to read. What do you think would happen to them that would be different if I give it to them and they actually read it before they start the divorce, and if they don't?
I think that having the ability to read the book and understand some of the ways in which the process works always is helpful to people.
But I have to tell you that I'm not going to give away the book for sure, because people need to read that. But you ruined this whole idea of a giraffe and an elephant with your last chapter. Well, so I'm not going to say what it is. I'm going to leave it a surprise, but you definitely ruined it.
Well, just remember that every rule has an exception.
Okay, yeah. Well, there you go. That's the best way you can take it. But if you want to really hear it, then you have to read the book. You have to read the last chapter, and don't read the last chapter first either.
That's right.
So you have some really cute lines here. You have some important things that you cover in the book, and you have some very touching things. So the first thing that really grabbed my attention is something that one of the plaintiffs said to you. I get really confused because all my ex-wives have the same first name. What made you remember that line? Because it's interesting and cute. Like, what happened there?
I happened to be at a large conference of divorce attorneys, and one of the main speakers was a tremendously bright, knowledgeable, and interesting speaker. And he is the one who told the story about during the course of his lifetime, he had 4 wives, and they all had the same first name, the plaintiff. So that's where it came from.
Yeah. Oh, well, that was a good one. People they do tend to get divorced and marry a second and third and fourth partner that has a lot of similar characteristics, sometimes even similar looks wise, which is very interesting. I mean, you get away and you go through this horrible divorce with one person, and then you marry another one that has almost the same things, which really makes no sense.
I can't tell you the number of times where I finished a divorce with somebody, and soon after, I may get a phone call about can I do a prenup for this divorced client? And when I ended up meeting the next proposed spouse in the context of negotiating the prenup, they were like a clone of the first person. And so I said, disregarding all of the laws of probability and chance, sometimes people think that it's going to work out much better the second time around, but it doesn't necessarily do that.
Yeah, I have to tell you personally, for me, I have done that. I ended up, I couldn't wait to get away from the first one. But after I was with my second one for maybe 6 months, I realized that they were practically a carbon copy. And it happens to be, I'm a therapist by training. And psychologically speaking, there is a specific phenomenon, a specific thing that we go through and why we attract the exact same people. So it's not
Right.
just a random thing that people do. And mostly it's not even conscious thing. Like you don't look at them and say, oh, this one is exactly like my ex-wife. Let me marry her. You don't do that. You go like, end up married and then you find out, oh my God, she's maybe the same, but maybe even worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is something I think that we can do if you go through therapy and you go through self-awareness of what you went through with the first time. You can avoid doing things like that.
Yes. Yes. And unfortunately, um, the statistics don't favor second and third marriages. The divorce rate goes up significantly. I think the current statistic is that about 60% of second marriages end in divorce, and the percentage goes up to 74% when it's a third marriage. So, there is something fundamentally going on that people haven't dealt with. And I think you're absolutely right about that.
Right. So, but also don't forget that a second marriage is also more complicated because now you might have children involved. You may have exes that
Yeah.
you have to deal with that complicates it. Marriage in itself is hard to begin with. Relationship is difficult. You're dealing with a person that isn't you, duh. So that's always difficult. I mean, some people have a hard time dealing even with themselves, much less other people.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
that makes sense. The whole thing makes sense. And I definitely am a proponent that if you're going to do it again, do it a little more wise, maybe a little more spiritual, a little more psychologically aware of what you're doing rather than, I like the way he looks, let's get married, which is how we mostly get married the first time. So,
Yes.
yeah. So you have some also really good advice, like when and how to know that your marriage is over. Because
Yes.
because it seems like a lot of people come to you and think that the divorce just jumped out of the blue or out of the sky. They had no clue at all that things were not going right. I find it really strange. Did you find that you had that a lot? And is that why you had to really like let people know how to know your marriage is over?
I think it was a surprising discovery for me that basically the people who came to my office fit into two broad categories. One category was composed of people who knew they wanted a divorce and often said during the course of the consultation, this has been coming for a long time, quote unquote. The second group of people are the people who say, I had no idea divorce was coming. It came out of the blue. I don't understand this. And I wasn't necessarily making a judgment about either group, but the first group of people who knew they wanted a divorce were there in my office basically to get information and to get things lined up. They were there to create their divorce plan, so to speak, before they announced it. Unfortunately, the other group who claimed that they didn't even realize the divorce was in the offing, they have no plan in place. They don't know where to begin. And this goes back to your original question about, so what does this book provide? it provides the information in the main for those people who don't know where to start. And I also I share your concern, if you will, that people who say, I had no idea this was coming, I think in their quiet moment, when they're alone, they really know that things are not right and this is not going well. They may not want to admit it to themselves, and they may not want to deal with the challenge ahead. But I think that, at its core, they're aware that things are not right.
Yeah, I think it would make sense for you to think that maybe even consciously or unconsciously they are aware. But I had a neighbor who was married to someone and they seemed like such a loving couple. He would come home from work and literally pick her up and carry her to the swimming pool. Every time, they never had fights. They had one child. They were both working. And on one fine day, her husband comes home and says, I'm in love with my secretary. Have a nice life. So
Yeah.
not only was she in shock, I was in shock, but the thing is, she was too much even in shock to go to an attorney or to do anything, because she literally went into a shock status. Like
Yeah.
all she could do was
Yes.
sit there, drink, put down the drink stayed there. For 3 months, she was like
Yeah.
totally out of it. So
Yeah.
maybe unconsciously she might have known something, but she had no clue consciously at all that he's having an affair, that he doesn't love her. She thought he was like completely and totally in love with her.
Yes. Yes. And so
And
you're
that could
right.
happen.
It absolutely does. As a matter of fact, I have a website, by the way, that discusses even more of these stories. And there's a very famous case in New York going on right now where the husband filed for divorce. And according to the wife, she found out about it reading it in the newspaper. That certainly for her is the case. The irony is the succeeding number of news articles about this demonstrated that he had been involved with another person for months and months. So, yeah, I mean, there are people who are genuinely shocked, and it's very difficult to get anyone to focus on what to do next, because the natural inclination is, if I just let this play out, maybe it'll get better. If I don't overreact to it, it may get better. You know, so
So you're right.
this is
You're talking about the legal aspect of it, which is a very
exactly.
complex, and I think the other side of it is the psychological aspect. If you really didn't have a clue, how could you not have had a clue? Were you ignoring it? Were you unable to accept it? Were you just
Right.
stupid? And most of these people are not stupid at all. These are very smart people. So the
Yeah.
psychological is also, I think, a huge element of it. Do they get psychological help when they go through a divorce, just when they come to you, or is it something they have to figure out themselves?
I think that the practice has changed over a course of time. I mean, the traditional role of the attorney is to be the legal advocate, to get the person through the legal process. Now, I expand on that role in the sense that the original version of what is an attorney was a counselor, not in the sense that you're a counselor, but someone who provides advice. Again, providing advice about the legal components of the matter. So, things have changed dramatically, and now people are tapping into additional resources. So, for example, one of the popular constructs these days is that people going through a divorce who have, real problems dealing with the psychological aspect of things obviously are in therapy, or they're turning to a new group of professionals called divorce coaches. One of the concerns that I have, and I've expressed it in a number of articles that I've written, is that this is a very tricky construct because most people assume, for example, that whatever they tell their divorce attorney is confidential. Those same people assume that whatever they tell their mental health professional is confidential. And perhaps even what they tell their divorce coach is confidential. And what we've come to learn, depending on where you reside, is none of these things are sacrosanct. Within the context of custody cases, people can actually get to the treatment notes of the mental health professionals. So these are all things that people need to be aware of. And that's what I do in, excuse me, that's what I try to do in my book. It's educate. It's be careful of this. Be aware of this. As a matter of fact, I actually, say in the book, be careful not only what you tell your attorney, but be mindful of what you should not be telling your attorney. So, which is really counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, and I was really, really glad that you covered that because people watch a lot of TV, and on TV the lawyer keeps saying, "Oh, I'm confidential," and they don't realize one of the things that I have a problem with. When you get licensed as an attorney, right, you pass the bar, you have to follow some guidelines. You have to follow the guidelines or you lose your licensing. As a therapist, getting a license means I also have to follow guidelines. As a matter of fact, people think that everything they say to a therapist, I'm not practicing as a therapist because I don't want to follow those guidelines right now. But one of those guidelines as a therapist is you have to submit a diagnosis to the insurance company as soon as you evaluate someone the first time they come in. Once you submit their diagnosis, there's nothing confidential about it. It's in the insurance files. Anybody can access it. And it actually could stigmatize you for life. So if you come in and I diagnose you as a manic depressive, that's going to follow you for the rest of your life, no matter where you go. So, so if you tell me that you have fantasies about killing your wife, which is an illegal thing that you do, which I'm mandated to report, that not only that is not confidential, a lot of the things you talk about in therapy are not confidential, and that's therapy. You're talking about counseling, not psychological counseling, but just regular, not therapeutic. Not therapeutic counseling.
Right.
Even that is not necessarily confidential because you still have your loyalty to the court. If the court forces you to say something, you can't not. You're going to lose your license, right? So
that's correct. And
right.
Attorneys have that same conundrum because we are required by our ethic code to keep certain information confidential. However, we are also required to certify as accurate statements which the client puts into the courthouse. So if they file a financial affidavit and they've told me that they're not putting on their financial affidavit the accounts that they have in the Cayman Islands, I can't certify that. Now, I can't disclose it, but when I don't certify it, a judge knows that there's something wrong.
Right. So basically, it's a red flag. It's a red flag. Like he can't certify. Where is this guy lying? He already knows that there's a lie going on there because you're not going to put yourself in jeopardy and lie. Right. And lie in court for somebody else. Right. So I think that's another really, really huge thing that people don't know. So one of the things that your book is so important is because it opens the eyes for people. Divorce is going to be difficult no matter what. Especially if it's a divorce where someone cheats on you, you feel betrayed or other things. But to know at least the legal aspects of it makes it that much easier. It makes life easier. They're not going to come and tell you, well, I have $3 million in this account, but I'm not going to say it and I'm not going to disclose it because it's cash. They're automatically putting you and themselves in jeopardy by saying it. Just shut up and don't say it. And learning that, and then if the wife finds out, you're still going to have to disclose it. But at least knowing that they're not putting you in that situation, and they're not putting themselves in that. So I think there's a lot of tips like that and a lot of important facts in the book. It's definitely worth reading it, especially for those who are getting a divorce. But I'm not getting a divorce, and I still got a lot out of it about relationships. And one of the things that people need to understand is that community property is community property. They can't come to you and say, how do I get out of community property? Your job is not to figure out how they can give less, they can hide assets. Because no matter how much they spend with you as a divorce attorney, no matter what you do, they're still at the end of the day going to be a 50-50 community property if it's a community property state, right?
Correct. New York is not, but I cite all the states in my book about who's community property or not.
Right. So if somebody comes to you to get a divorce and they want to fight it out because they want to not split everything 50-50, even if it's not a community property, they're still at the end of the day, they're probably going to be asked to split everything 50-50. And right?
I think that's true, but I think there's another element of this. The goal of all of this is to make a deal which everybody can live with. Sometimes to make that deal, you may give up some of your litigation positions. You may say, you know what, I can take the strict position that this is a community property state. I want my 50% and that's it. But, while that's a legitimate statement under the law, the other spouse who has to interact with their ex-spouse, they have children together. Those children have to be educated. You have to, create the groundwork for someday you may be at, the children's wedding together years after the divorce. Sometimes the prudent thing is to, not adhere to the strict requirements of the law if there are benefits that the person realizes, particularly in the post-divorce period.
Right. So what you're saying is that whether they go to an attorney or not, that's something they're going to have to compromise on if they really want to maintain a relationship and raise children together and eventually run into each other at their children and eventually grandchildren or whatever, rather than cut each other's throat and become royal enemies forever.
Right. And I'm also suggesting that people are free to, chart their own course. And while you can take strict litigation positions and be absolutely right under the law, sometimes there is a benefit to reaching a deal, and in that process, giving up perhaps some of your litigation positions. I'm not saying you should or you have to. I'm saying you have to take a look at the entire landscape, not only what's happening during the divorce, but also what happens afterwards.
Exactly. I have to tell you something that my ex told my daughter when she got married, and she told him that I was going to be at the wedding. And he said that it's okay, I can come to the wedding, but I have to promise not to look at him and not to talk to anyone that he's talking to. That's
Okay.
that's how long he held the grudge. We're talking about my daughter got married about 17 years after we got divorced.
Right. And look what it did to your daughter, putting her in the middle of, it's just, you sometimes wish that people would take a step back and, give some consideration to not only the ex-spouse, but the children and what's really the appropriate thing to do. So
Right. The least you can do is take the children. Forget the ex-spouse. You hate them. They're horrible people, whatever. But the children are your children too. So for their sake, but some people are not able to, obviously.
no.
Some people are, but what
Yeah.
can you do? So yeah, so there's so many different things. There was this one story that you talked about someone having a mistress, and when the woman found out what divorce was really about, she said something like, "Our mistress is a lot prettier than Mike's mistress," and I really like that one.
Yeah, I
Like,
know.
okay, I'm not gonna get married, but make sure your mistress is pretty, right?
That's right. That's
So you have a lot of things like that throughout the book, and I don't really want to read the book, and I don't really want to give that much away. But is there anything else that you could think of? And yeah, you do have it in the book that you say that your divorce attorney is not your therapist. It's a really, really big distinction that you have to be aware of.
yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and then you say something like on one page, you say your attorney is definitely not your sexual partner.
Right. Right.
um, and I don't know. I think also, I think another thing that people really don't realize is the judges are powerful, but matrimonial judges are especially so. Explain that, because I don't think people understand how much power the judge ultimately have in the divorce.
Okay. So that statement stems from the fact that matrimonial judges have an incredible, enormous amount of discretion in their cases. Yes, they're guided by legal principles. Yes, they are, in fact, required to write decisions that discuss all of the factors in the case and all of those things. But ultimately, these judges have huge discretion about whether the evidence supports one position or supports the other position. And if I don't like one of the parties in the case, if one of the parties either has been difficult or is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, that judge has the ability to punish that person. And they punish that person by using that ultimate uh, amount of discretion that they have. And let's not forget, judges are human. They come to the process. They've been divorced. They have family members who are divorced. They've seen what has happened. They come to their task with their own built in biases, prejudices, and the like. And so it is critically important for people to understand that the judge that you're appearing on before is the person making the decision. No jury, no 6 people, 12 people in a box or anything like that. It's the judge. And that's one of the most important things that I talk to my clients about. I often said, even if we have to go to trial, I tell them, your testimony begins in the elevator of the courthouse, because you never know who's standing there. You never know if there's a person who's attached to the judge's part, and you have to be, punctilious about not being a difficult individual. The judge will punish you if you are.
And I think even further than that, you were talking about if the judge doesn't like your attorney.
Yes, yes. And so that's an important question to when you're interviewing an attorney. The question really is, what's your relationship with Judge so and so or the judges in this county? Because and I have a long case that we won't repeat now, but
But it's in the book. Yeah.
but in the book, and the essence of the case is, if the judge hates your lawyer, you're not doing well.
Never.
The
Right. Right.
and it doesn't matter what your attorney says about what the law is or not.
Right. So what happens if the judge ignores the legal guidelines that he has to go by? What's the ramification?
So obviously everyone has their right to appeal the trial court determination.
So there's no ramification. There's just the right to appeal.
The right to appeal. And the results of appellate decisions, are extremely varied. You can read 100 cases and they seem to contradict each other. But if there's a glaring error, if the judge was in fact acting out of malice, of bias, that something like that, made a determination which is clearly at odds with the case law, that'll be reversed on appeal. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that the person may be going back for another trial. They've just finished, a 2-year process that led to a trial, and now they may have to go back, or hopefully the appellate court will just, correct the error.
Which is excruciating. It's
It is,
excruciating process. It's not like it's personal, it's emotional. It's not an easy process. So at the end of the day, what you say in the book, which I think is also really important for people to understand, that it's not a whole lot of judges. If you're in a certain area, you're probably going to be stuck with one judge, and it's almost impossible to have that judge recuse himself from a case. So,
right.
So if the judge really has something against you, if he doesn't like your nose for some reason, or your attorney, there's not much you can do about it. You have to go through the process with that judge, and then you can always appeal it. That's what you're saying.
Right. That's correct.
So that's another element of court that people never even take into consideration. Like, you'll hear people, well, I have evidence, I have this, I have this, I have this. Well, all this is nice and great, but at the end of the day, somebody else makes the decision.
For people who say, I have all the evidence, those are clients I love. If they have the evidence, this is good. A lot of times I have the opposite. I know that my husband is hiding cash. I know that he's having an affair. Okay, what proof do you have of this? I know it. I know it doesn't help.
No, not much. So yeah, what I was saying is, even if you have all that proof, it may not even be that helpful. But if you have no proof, then you're putting the lawyer in such a bad situation, because you can't just come into court and make all kinds of claims if you have zero proof to it.
Right.
Most people
know. This conversation, I'd really like to stress one thing. The intent of the book is how to stay out of court.
Right. And I think that's really the most important thing, is stay out of court if you can. Realize that going to court isn't your savior. It's your last resort. And I like that.
Yes. And I think that's the message, the basic message of the book, how to navigate through the process, hopefully avoiding the courthouse, but, also having the ability, if, your spouse is just unreasonable, to go to court if you need to. And having an attorney.
Mostly in divorce, the spouse is unreasonable. Otherwise, they probably would not be getting a divorce.
Exactly.
So I'd like to end with a quote that I really like, of a woman that said at the end of her, when she came to you, and she said, I want to leave this marriage the same way I came into it, a widow. I love that one.
Yeah. That's in the chapter on great departing lines and gestures.
Right. I really like it. So definitely, I recommend, if you are getting a divorce, read this book first. But if you're not getting a divorce, read this book anyway, because it's informational. It's important. It's a huge part of our society that we need to know about. It's not something, I don't know anybody that doesn't know somebody that got divorced if they didn't get divorced themselves. Personally, I got divorced once was enough for me, but there are people that go through it a couple of times. And I would say, what's the divorce rate right now? Do you know? Because it's huge.
The figure always bounces around a bit. The figure that I use is approximately 50% of first marriages end in divorce. There are various ways of counting that, but that's a fair, statement of what's happening. And the problem that came up recently, COVID even pushed things further. COVID not only made it more difficult for people to get out of, to get married, but also made it more difficult to get out of a marriage. So that's a whole other subject, but I cover it in the book.
Right. I think one of the things that COVID did is it forced people to be together 24 hours a day. And
yes.
That's a huge challenge on a good day.
Yes.
But on a time when you really have no choice, that everything is closed, that you can't go anywhere, you find out things about your spouse that you may have been married for 20 years with them and you never even realized.
Right. And the other irony is that COVID particularly hit hard newly married people. You would think that, it wouldn't be the newlyweds who were getting, divorced in COVID, but they got hit really hard. So
even more so, I think, because I think when you get married, you go through a honeymoon phase where the spouse can do no wrong. But once you get through the honeymoon space and you have to get to know each other, there's an adjustment period where you really have to learn how to deal with all the things you don't like about your spouse, because all the things you like, you really don't have to learn how to deal with it. Learning how to deal with all the things you don't like while you're pushed together 24/7 is really, really difficult. So if the honeymoon is over so much faster when you're together all the time. So
yeah,
COVID made you stay together. The honeymoon that usually takes a 4-year process. I would say it would take a 4-week process to get it to be over. And then you have to deal with all those things to acceptance. And how do I deal with this about my partner? How do I deal with this? Can I live with it? Can I not live with that?
right.
That's something that's very hard to do. And also when you were locked up, you didn't have any therapeutic help, hardly. You didn't have any psychological help. Like you had to deal with the fear of the COVID, plus the fear of being married if you just got married. Plus you wake up in the morning and say, who am I married to? Who is this person?
Yes, yes,
It's a huge, huge problem with the lockdown, which I hope was worth it.
yeah.
But, we'll know one day. So yes, I think we covered the most important things that you did write about. Do you think we missed anything?
Of all of the things that I did and covered in the book, I think what I take particular pride about is the very last section called Final Summation,
I
which
love that. That was my favorite, by the way. Yeah.
which kind of like it was a summary of the book. It was hopeful. It was important because it provided a very sound plan for moving past your divorce. And that's what I particularly liked about it.
Yeah, I liked it a lot too, and I got a lot out of it. But I think reading that in itself without reading the book, you would not get as much benefit from it as you
That,
would after you read the book and you read about all these other aspects of divorce. Then everything you say at the final summation is connected to all the other aspects. So it
that's
actually makes it a lot bigger, a lot more understandable.
yes, yes.
Yeah, that
I
was a great idea. I love that. They kind of made it like a legal brief. So in the final analysis, this is how I'm going to surmise it. It was very, very clever. I really
thank you.
like that. And so we're not going to tell anyone about your last chapter other than
Right.
just read the book. And I think the best advice is don't get divorced.
If you can avoid it, yes, but if you find yourself in this place, make sure that you get the information and the help you need.
Right? Don't get caught without knowing what to do or get too emotional so that you cannot really do anything.
Right.
Like you freeze and you can't do anything. And next thing you know, and I have a friend like that. The next thing you know, she doesn't have a house. She doesn't have any money. She has nothing left out of a 20-year marriage because she was so frozen and so emotionally afraid that she wasn't even be able to do anything. So you
Yes.
don't want to do that. And I think by reading this book, it makes everything more objective. It makes you realize that it's not just you. It's not just a personal thing. It's a social thing. It's things that a lot of people go through. Knowing what you know about divorce now, which I'm sure you didn't know when you started practicing, and being that you've been through everything that you've been through, if you had to choose a field of practice, would you still go back to divorce?
Yes.
Really?
But here's the caveat. Yes, having practiced for 40 years, not being in the midst of it right now, and having the ability to look back at it from my point of view now, meaning that this book allowed me the opportunity to think about the ways in which I helped people, the people who were grateful for what I did, the tremendously interesting area of law that this is. But something that you said before was when you're going through it, it's just horrible. And so that's true to a certain extent for the attorneys too. It's difficult work. It's difficult to go through. But now when I look back at it, I can't imagine doing anything else.
Okay, so I'll put it a different way. If you could talk to your younger self, to that person that had just gotten, just passed bar, the day you passed bar, and your younger self is asking you, should I go do the divorce or should I just go do business law? What would you tell him? Because he doesn't know everything that you know. He knows nothing about divorce.
Right. I would tell him that this is a tremendously important and challenging field, and it's certainly something that is worth consideration.
Helping. Would you tell your younger self to maybe hire a personal therapist to take you through?
well, sometimes, when we're in practice, when I'm talking to the client, one of my first suggestions is, do you have a therapist?
Yeah, but I'm talking about you. You're part of it. The clients need a therapist, no question about that. Everybody that's going through a divorce, having a therapist is a luxury, but I also think it's a necessity. But for the attorney, because you're also going through a lot of that stuff. You concerned maybe if there's kids that you might think are in danger.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I totally understand what you're saying, because in my lifetime I've had many sleepless nights.
Exactly. That's exactly my point, because you have dilemmas, and also legally sometimes there's not much you can do about it.
Or there is no answer.
Yeah, it's not even possible. It's not up to you even to solve that.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Like my ex, which I'm not going to go into, but anyway, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Ron.
Thank you.
And have a great evening, and hopefully we shall see each other again.
Thank you very much for having me.
And before I go here, let me just show you, this is my book on Amazon. It's called Wake Up and Plan for Roses. It is about planning your life consciously, because we actually plan our life unconsciously if we don't have an active plan. So might as well make it active, might as well make it the way you like it. So if you want the book, it's Wake Up and Plan for Roses on Amazon. Yay!